the one thing that I really wanted to start off with, of course, is chatting about the newest publication that you put out, which of course is Dracula, annotated for the 125th anniversary. Uh, the one thing I love about that, of course, is that it includes the original ending, as well as about 30,000, or I guess more specifically, 101 pages that were missing from the book that we all love and have come to enjoy from Dracula. So I guess the first obvious question would be, where have these lost pages been for the last 125 years?
Well, Rick, as usual, I love your investigative mind, and it's so close to what I like to try to do to, figure out, some of these cool mysteries. Obviously, you're a big fan, as I am. I just happen to be a family member that's lucky enough to, have access to a lot of this stuff, or just one little piece leads to another, which is pretty cool. So yeah, there's a lot of things that the novel Dracula, things have come to light, let's say, in the last 125 years of this novel, that because of discoveries, number one, of the Dracula notes that have been in the Rosenbach Museum since the 60s. These are the 125 pages of notes that Bram used for his research. And then also the manuscript, also called a typescript because it's technically typed, that the Paul Allen estate out in Seattle, Washington owns. And a lot of those pieces in the typescript lead to all kinds of mysteries, and partly because the thing starts on page 102, and also there's lots of things that are deleted from that actual typescript, and things added in. So you actually get, when you get a chance to analyze this, and not many people have, lucky enough I have, and Robert 18 Bassang has, and Robert is the fellow that I co-edited, co-annotated this 120th anniversary of Dracula, the annotated edition on. J.D. Barker and I actually went out to Seattle, Washington to do our research on when we were writing Dracula, the prequel to Dracula. And that's what gave me my insight into it. Robert had much more extensive studying on it. And what we got, Rick, was certain things that we had feelings that really may have been missing. We had an understanding of the edited ending, because we're not the only guys that have looked at it. But I think what's unique about our approach and what came out in this book is that we have put these pieces of puzzle together, and this is kind of how I sort of explain my work: is this massive puzzle maker guy that gets bits and pieces, some of which have been discovered from other people, but I make sense of it because I'm sort of a clearinghouse. And so, yeah, where have these pages been? Well, I wouldn't say they're hiding in plain sight. Some of the things have been published. And now that this Dracula edition has been published, a lot of the things that have been edited out or missing, or sort of missing in action from the novel Dracula in Bram's writing process are now available in this annotated Dracula. So I'm glad you've been interested in it. I'm glad we're having a chat today to talk about some of that process and what are some of the hidden gems in it.
It was. I have to say, I went into it with a little bit of slight. I don't know if you call it a concern or not, but trepidation maybe, because I know when we had chatted before, you mentioned that you changed some of the shading of the text to differentiate between what was added, and I think the stuff that was added was underlined. The stuff that was missing from the original manuscript was shaded in a different font and a different color.
Right.
And I thought, well, that seems like it's going to be confusing, but it's not at all. Like it's perfect. And I know we talked offline about this before, about how you wanted that to be. It's almost like a choose your own adventure sort of approach in a sense, because you can choose to enjoy the book the way it was always meant to be written. If you want to enjoy it from more of a point of view, you've got that missing text that stood out that when you're going into the new territory, which is super cool. You even have some of Bram's handwritten his typescript that he put in there, which I thought was amazing. And I'm glad to know that my handwriting is not the messiest I've ever seen. And then if you want to take more of a scholarly approach to it as well, you could do that, because of course you and the amazing work that you did with Robert, all the annotations are there, all the bottoms, and then it's up to now the reader to be able to put those pieces together as they want to, and digest the whole book in its entirety as they want to, which I thought was a pretty cool approach to it.
Yeah, I mean, it was a dilemma on how to present the material, because there was so much there, and we thought, we want people to get a chance to read this novel in the way that Bram constructed it, but also in a way that he deconstructed it also. And here's, that sounds confusing, but you alluded to the shaded area. One of the cool things that I had in my possession, which is an incredible family heirloom and a piece of history, is a first edition of Dracula that Bram's great-grandson owned, that he had passed down to him, and it was given to him by his publisher, who asked Bram to reduce the word count by 30,000 words so that they could publish the first abridged edition in paperback of Dracula. So this would happen in 1901. So the original Dracula came out in 1897. 1901, Archibald Constable puts out the first abridged edition, and that's the one for the really interested viewers here who are into covers like I am, where the Dracula character is face down coming down the wall, which is just a cool visual. But what I had for a few months, Rick, is a copy of Dracula, kind of like the one over my shoulder here. That's not a first edition. That's a facsimile edition. But you've got pencil marks throughout the whole book that Bram is realizing some are whole passages cut out, some are sentences cut out. When he cuts out certain things, sometimes he writes in bridge words to reconnect. So he has been charged with taking out 30,000 words, and he does this in a very meticulous way. Not only does he cut out the passages on the pages, but he goes to the table of contents in each chapter and writes down how many words he's taken out. So that, it's sort of that clerk of petty sessions approach that Bram was, that very analytical side of Bram.
Right.
that is charged with the job, take out 30,000 words, and by golly, he's not going to take out many more than that. But it gives you the idea of what was going in Bram's mind while he was having to do this painstaking job. And I'm sure if there's other authors who are listening to this, and Rick, I know you write as well, it's like, oh gosh, how do you take out some of these words? This is gold. But what you kind of see is he takes out things that are overly descriptive, or even things that are references to Shakespeare, which Robert, his theory was, and it makes sense, that since this is being cut down to a less expensive book, paperback book, that it's probably getting in the hands of people that are not quite as sophisticated, may not go and watch Shakespeare. So those are some of the things that come out. So it's kind of cool to think, why do you take this out? Why do you take that out? So that covers the things that Bram took out. But I'm glad that you liked it from the standpoint it didn't make it hard to read, to have grayscale, just kind of a shading over those words.
Yeah, no, it was completely seamless. I thought it worked extremely well. And I think that's the yellow color, I think, right? I want to make sure I'm looking. Was that the original book that came out as a yellow cover?
Well, it's complicated because the first, it came out looking like this one over my shoulder, this yellow cover. But there was like 6 or 7 editions that came out with, it's first edition, but different printings. So they were all coming out that way with that same yellow cover. It's complicated. Some people think, oh, I've got this yellow one with the red writing, just like the one here. Right. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a 1897 first edition. That's what it was based on, but they have different printings of them. So you got to be careful of what you're buying if you're getting into the antiquarian book market. So our introduction explains all of this. Let's call it the hieroglyphics of what's in this book. We have things that originally Robert and I were thinking crossing the words out to show what was actually crossed out in the typescript. And actually, when I was studying it with J.D. Barker, it was really hard to study because we needed a magnifying glass because it was really well crossed out with a pencil and sometimes a blue marker, a blue crayon, excuse me. So it was hard to read, even though it was typed, what was taken out. So, I mean, and we were searching for gold here. When I was doing the studying, it was like, what was taken out? What are those things that Bram had in right till the last minute? Because this is the typescript that Bram paid a typing service to type up from his handwritten manuscript, and then it goes to his publisher. Obviously, he sat with his publisher with this 480-page thing. And over time, I'm not sure how many sittings, but the two of them did a lot of edits, some crossouts, some additions, and even Bram's eldest brother, Thornley Stoker, who was a famous doctor. He was knighted for being the head of the Royal College of Surgeons, who was Bram's medical advisor for the novel Dracula. And there's a lot of medical things. We're not just talking the physical stuff. We're talking the Renfield, the mental patient stuff. All this medical stuff in Dracula was accurate to a T because his brother helped him. His handwriting and his additions and deletions and notes are also all over this typescript to make sure that his brother got it right.
Man, that is amazing. And I know, and speaking of Robert, and I know I believe he's Canadian, at the University of Toronto, if I'm not mistaken.
No, he's a West Coast guy. The person who I'm associated with from U of T was Elizabeth Miller. She was responsible for many things in the Dracula world.
Gotcha.
Many prominent things. One was the Lost Journal that helped me, but her and Robert actually deciphered and published the facsimile edition of the Dracula notes. Robert actually is from Vancouver, and he's a noted vampire expert, had a huge vampire library, and Robert had published many things during his life, and he wanted this to be his sort of crowning jewel, and sadly it was. I mean, I say this sadly because he passed away, Rick, just a couple of months after we finished working on the on this book. Robert didn't like to finish a project. He kept always kind of tinkering with it. Robert, is this the final manuscript I send to the publisher? Oh no, I got something I got. And I mean, this is terrible to say, but he'll be chuckling up in heaven. It's like
it never ends.
It never ends. And sadly, I mean, this is how it did end.
Yeah.
It ended for poor Robert because he had a minor heart attack, went to the hospital to have it looked at, and they were preparing him for a stint, and they got him on all the blood thinners and everything, and unfortunately he got out of his bed and fell, banged his head, and in a most ironic way he ended up with a brain bleed, much like Renfield did in Dracula. But with all the medication they had him on for blood thinning to stop the clotting, they couldn't save him. And unfortunately, he passed away peacefully. His wife was with him, reading to him some of his favorite poetry as he expired. So it really is his crowning jewel in a long, sort of esteemed life in the vampire world. He also was big in the Jack the Ripper world, so Victorian era kind of writer and collector. And so his footprints are all over this book, with a multitude of footnotes that he was able to bring to this, referring to all different versions of Dracula that had been annotated before, and lots of different insights. I was able to contribute a lot of family stuff and my personal insights into my research into Bram and why he wrote certain things the way he did. And then I think the coolest thing is both of us brought our memory and our experiences working on the Dracula typescript to then introduce that into this novel, so people can read it and say, I wonder who took that out, because now we have them underlined, Rick, as you mentioned. They're underlined. Everything underlined in the book is what was taken out, and then this Lucinda handwriting font is what Bram himself wrote in at the typescript stage.
Okay.
So some things he just left blank, and which is kind of strange, because like right up to the very end of his handing this over to the publisher, things were blank. Like he just didn't have it, he didn't have the full idea yet. Or since he had to cross something out to make sense of it, he had to write something in. So that the reader gets to see all this. So you're literally, it's looking like you're peering over Bram Stoker's shoulder for an extended period of time while he's writing the book, while he's editing the book, while his publisher edits the book, and you get to see all the juicy bits.
And speaking of, I mean, the juiciest bits, of course, are these lost or previously lost journals. I know you mentioned, I'm going to ask you for a little bit of expansion here, if you will, that you did mention that that they're all ultimately right there, they're hiding in plain sight. What do you mean by that? Where exactly where they?
So here's what we figure out with the typescript starting at page 102. That means there's 101 missing pages at some point. When you analyze the Dracula notes,
Yeah.
you get to see things that from note form didn't make it into even the manuscript or the typescript form. And in Dracula notes, there was about 6 pages that listed a series of letters back and forth to central characters in the novel. Peter Hawkins, the lawyer, to Count Dracula, Hawkins to Paxton, who was the head of the Incorporated Society of Lawyers, Mina and Lucy, also other friends of Lucy's and Mina's. So you begin to see what I believe to be, and Robert concurred, was the first chapter was a series of letters establishing the relationship between all these characters in the book. And this was very similar to what Bram Stoker did in his life as a theater manager. He mentioned in his personal reminiscence of Henry Irving, he wrote hundreds of letters every day. Of course, that's how they communicated with the press, right, with friends, with people who wanted tickets, with set designers, with actors, all this. So what I think is part of that 101 missing pages is the actual letters that Bram had listed, who they were for, and to and from. Nowhere have we ever found the actual letters, because there is no manuscript that anybody's ever discovered. Just this typescript that starts at 102. So it's the notes that we take this from. So that, I think, was chapter 1. Okay. And it makes, and we list all these letters that Bram listed in his notes. So that sort of covers some of the missing background and why sometimes critics claim that Bram Stoker just started his story without us really understanding the relationship between all of the people in the book. How did, we got little references to Quincy Morris, Arthur Holmwood, and Dr. Seward, who have traveled to different places, in exotic places, and fought in battles together and hunted together, but we don't really know much about that. So I think what's happened is all of that pre-characterization and relationship building was within the letters that Bram intended, and his editor probably said it's too long. And the reason I say that is that we do have proof about chapter 2. And chapter 2, I believe, and now I can say this because I can tell you, I'll read to you the proof shortly, is that the short story Dracula's Guest, that was published in 1914, 2 years after Bram died, published by Bram's widow, Florence published it with a series of other short stories. And the preface to this was, this was part of my husband's most famous work, Dracula. It was edited out due to length. Well, if the publisher is going to edit out a complete story like Dracula's Guest, which is all about a Jonathan Harker character arriving into Munich. He's got a day or so to blow off before he gets on the train to head off to Vienna and then Budapest and Bucharest and so on. He's certainly going to cut out these letters. So I think the letters go, Dracula's guest goes, and then the final third chapter that I think was missing, again, Robert concurred, was similar but not quite as many of these references in the body of Dracula to the Munich Dead House and Night at the Opera. So there was 2 references to the Munich Dead House in Dracula that got crossed out. So that means, and just like Dracula's Guest, which had 4 references crossed out, if the editor actually said, Mr. Stoker, cut all this stuff out, Bram's going to have to go through, since it's already been typed up and ready to go to the printer.
Find all the references.
He's got to go to the rest of the manuscript and cross out these things so it makes sense. And that's where I say we've now found the proof. 2 of us, Bassang and myself, concurred that these were all parts that mentioned a hairy kind of experience in Munich with a vampire and a wolf and so on. And then this kind of weird experience where Jonathan Harker recognized the Count in London when Jonathan and Mina went in for Peter Hawkins' funeral, and they're driving around in the carriage going back to the train station, and they saw this man, this dark, tall, dark man who looked like the man in the dead house. Well, that was
the white mustache, and
exactly that was referenced before it was taken out.
Interesting. And that's it really is fascinating too. And now that I've gotten definitely much better background of everything too, and you mentioned about the missing letters, because Quincy and Dr. Seward as well, they're essentially in the manuscript, they're ultimately presented as former suitors of Lucy's that just sort of, or Mina's rather, that just sort of go off to the wayside. And then while all these things are happening, of course, and she's getting all this blood loss, and Van Helsing comes in, and all of a sudden they're kind of there. They sort of migrate back towards her and surround her, and then ultimately, become part of the band of heroes that we see at the end. But yeah, it's never really discussed in the book of, well, why are they all of a sudden just there? Why would they be up to date on everything that's happening with her, especially as Van Helsing is clearly a very, very private man, and he's keeping it very much, all these happenings and all the facts of the matters very much within the very tight circle of the band of heroes.
Yeah, there's I'm glad you said that. There's obviously a pre-existing bond between these characters. Otherwise, just as you said, they were friendly when all 3 of them, Seward, Homewood, and Quincy Morris, were suitors of Lucy, and 2 of them were rejected. They still stayed good friends, and they said, look, we've all got to, we've suffered through this. We've been around campfires before in the Marquesas. We've done all these wild things. You won this battle this day, my friend. You've got the woman. And yet, when push comes to shove and they realize that the vampire is about, and Lucy is now in great need of good men, as a monster is about, they literally roll up their sleeves and give their own blood. And in the case of Quincy Morris, spoiler alert, if you haven't read Dracula or seen a movie in the last 125 years, he dies at the end. He sacrifices himself to help Harker get at the body and stab the Count. So, that's interesting, sort of writing technique that I think Bram employed, but the editor is the editor and they get to chop it out. But let's go back to Dracula's Guest, because as a story, and what I want to tell you, and I just want to read to you guys off of a printout of the book, is some of the little pieces, an example of what I found in the typescript that was taken out. So to prove to you that Dracula's Guest was once part of it. So here's a
please do.
Here's a piece that says, now this is where Jonathan Harker is complaining of a sore throat. He says, she started back and pointed to my throat where the rubbing of the wolf's tongue still left red. Her eyes flashed angrily with bitter disgust before the cruel smile returned to her red lips and she grew close to me. This is one of the women in white that are coming in to have the blood exchange with Jonathan. And he's saying, my throat is sore from the rubbing of the wolf's tongue. Now, you know this, Rick, and I know this, and many of other listeners that have read Dracula's Guest know darn well that this is the big wolf at the end of the story when Harker is thrust outside of the tomb in the massive snowstorm. He's going to die unless he gets help and stayed warm. He's going to die from hypothermia. And this wolf appears, lies down on top of him, and keeps him warm by licking him with his file-like tongue, but keeps him warm. And so the question is, why didn't he bite him? Was this one of Dracula's sort of minions? The wolf that is just keeping him alive until he can get to Transylvania, looking out over him, sort of a guardian angel, let's just say. So that was crossed out of the novel, but it certainly appeared in the actual story. Another one, this is when Count Dracula and Jonathan Harker are speaking during that first dinner that Harker has. He says, Dracula seemed very interested, especially at my adventures in Munich, when I told him of the wolf which had laid on my chest, saving my life in the cold, and whose howling seemed to direct the soldiers to where I was. He appeared quite excited. So again, another reference to that scene in Munich. And then another time when he was in the carriage and he was given a cross from one of the fellow travelers in the carriage, he said, as I looked at them, I unconsciously put my hand to my throat, which was still sore from the licking of the gray wolf. So again, 3 more cases where you see crossed out that were references to things that happened with the gray wolf. And then one more, though, the first night that Harker got to the castle, he actually said, I didn't sleep well, though my bed was comfortable enough, for I had all sorts of queer dreams of the dead house at Munich, which gets more strange and terrible whenever I think of it. It all seems so strange and mysterious. So this is a reference, Rick, to chapter 3, the Munich dead house, which you wonder, why do people go to dead houses? What is the the inspiration for that? You've got to understand that in the Victorian era, people were sort of drawn to cemeteries and mortuaries. Cemeteries because it was a nice park-like atmosphere, and you could commune with the spirits of your lost loved ones. People also went to the dead house because they were the family members. People were laid out on these tables, marble tables, for 2 or 3 days before they could be buried, and that's obviously to avoid premature burial. Yeah, and so they wanted to make sure they were actually dead. So that, generally speaking, they had 2 things to have to worry about. One, the smell. So it was like lots of flowers. And number 2, they had either their foot or their hand attached to a wire that went up to the top and a bell, so that if the body moved, the bell would go off, and then the guard would come and see what the heck's going on. So it was usually
the origin of the bell ringer.
Exactly. Yeah. So in Bram Stoker's life, we do know that Henry Irving was quite interested in being like the most incredible actor. The guy took his acting very seriously. He also wanted to look at what dead bodies look like. How do I play a dead body lying on the stage? So he was known to go and visit the dead houses, the mortuaries in different places. Did Bram and Irving go to the one in Munich? There's a good chance, we just don't know, but he certainly had his character go there. And that's how detectives like me and Bassang find these things, and then cross-reference to the notes, cross-reference to the typescript, and you look at Bram's life and Irving's life. Yeah, that makes sense. and it made kind of logical sense for the story sequencing to be taking the train, arriving into Munich, a day and a half or 2 days spent there before the train then leaves, because it didn't leave every day off to Klausenberg,
Right.
to Romania. So that's some of the early stuff, Rick.
Very cool. And it does make sense that he would have been at the dead house as well, because he was so meticulous with absolutely everything else. Save for the fact that he never went to Transylvania, but clearly living around that region and visiting all the other areas around that region, it sounds like it made perfect sense that he's probably riding the train, maybe with Irving, and writing all these notes as he went along, and then translating that as part of his original typescript.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that, in transit kind of stuff done.
Yeah.
Because I've seen the notes. Some of it looks like it was written on his knee, because only like the top part of the page was kind of cut in half. And
that's interesting.
I don't know if any of your listeners do this, but I've known when I'm driving in the car, if I've got sort of a piece of paper and I've got to have a note down, a story idea, I'll stick it on my knee, and
Yeah.
when I pull it up, because I'm right-handed, it goes on my right knee. That left side of the page that at the angle doesn't get written on. I found about 5 pages of Bram's the same thing. So
Interesting.
I think he probably did that in a carriage or in a train. The rest of it, even though in those days paper was very expensive, he wrote quite small, but they also used a lot of the paper. Sometimes it's just unavoidable.
Yeah. And where are all these notes now? Are they in the Rosenbach Museum, or do they reside somewhere else?
No, good thing you asked, because these guys deserve a good plug, because the Rosenbach Museum does a great job exhibiting these things. They also have allowed them to be published. And as I said earlier in the show, Elizabeth Miller was saying, published these things, I think, in about 2000 and maybe 9. They came out, and so McFarland is their publisher. I think the paperback is still available. I still think it's in print. Otherwise, you can find it on eBay. I've got a couple of copies because they're gold to me. I bring them with me even when I go to places like Whitby or Cruden Bay, Scotland, where I know a lot of them were written. And, I'd love to see, because it's even got things like Bram sketches. He sketches the harbor in Whitby. He sketches certain coastlines, because when he wants to have the action here, remember, he does his note taking, and then sometimes a year or 2 years later, he starts his writing. So everything's got to come together well for him to actually do the writing. And these notes that live in the Rosenbach are sort of background notes. One of the cool things, Rick, about the notes, they also list 26 books in the very back that he used as his reference. And that's another discovery that you and I have chatted about, and we reference this in this annotated Dracula. We now know exactly what resources Bram used when he was discussing things like vampirism, sleepwalking, trance, somnambulism, different superstitions in different places, the maps that he used, all in the London Library, because he listed these things in his notes. That's how we've been able to confirm all that.
Now, regarding his sketches, that's one, and I appreciate you mentioning that as well. Of course, he had his own art group that he was involved with for some time. Do these sketches exist in publication anywhere else outside of the Rosenbach Museum? And I apologize if this is asking you to plug another publisher or author. That was something that I was certainly curious about.
No, that's okay. Unfortunately, they're not. I've been able to get my hands on, by auction, a couple of his non-Dracula sketches. So let's back up a little bit. As a child growing up, Bram and his sister Matilda were very, very good drawers. And we're talking kids here, but they got awards for good quality drawing by the Royal Hibernian Society. So, his mother was interested in, helping promote the kids, and they drew nice pictures. Unfortunately, we don't have any of those pictures that he got awards for. But what we know is he took his art quite seriously. And even though he was involved in sports, a big-time athlete at Trinity College, very involved in things like the Philosophical Society, Historical Society, drama, debating at Trinity. He had time to be a founding member of the Dublin Painting and Sketching Club, which is still a club active to this day, and they count Bram, not only as a founding member, but a very famous and valuable member for his contributions in pulling it all together. And they have helped me ascertain that even though these sketches that myself and another collector were able to purchase are most likely originated from Bram Stoker's hand, they are not signed, but they look so much like his style of drawing from some of his working sketches from the Dracula notes. I have thought about at someday maybe including these in sort of a booklet, so that if people wanted to focus more on just Bram's art, but it's too bad there's nothing like really cool paintings that we found. They're just kind of schematic sketches, although the ones that I have are equestrian, because his brother was big into horses, and I think he was drawing for studying purposes, for doing practicing, trying to get the anatomy of a horse just right, and where a rider would sit and all that kind of thing. And there's also another lovely one about it looks like a mother and a child. I'm convinced it's Florence and young Noel. So there's not enough yet discovered, Rick, to turn it into a book. So if people want to see it, you got to go out and purchase McFarlane's Notes for Dracula, and you'll see some of his sketches. But they're pretty cool when you go to Whitby and you hold it there and you go, yeah, that's the piers, that's where the Demeter ship came in. Here's the route up the steps, the 199 steps up to St. Mary's Churchyard. So they're accurate. They may not be necessarily gorgeously beautiful pieces of art. They're sketches for working purposes.
Sure. So where do you have the sketches that you've purchased?
I've got Bram. I keep them in. I have a vault for all my cool Bram Stoker stuff.
Okay.
I've got letters that I mean, this stuff is expensive when you've got to buy your own relatives' things on different auction houses. But I tend to really focus on really meaningful things, Rick, like these sketches that it's been hard to attribute any sketches to Bram Stoker. These ones we have, but I've also got some pretty cool letters that really helped me in my research, and I'll just share one with you guys that is really interesting to me. It was written, number one, it had letterhead from where Bram was living in London in 1907, I believe. I'm just thinking now because I haven't looked at it in a while. So it's not, no, maybe it's less than that. Maybe it's 6, because it's just a year after Henry Irving died. And Bram Stoker was conversing with an American opera singer who was also interested in producing an opera on stage, and he was hiring Bram to be the manager, the theater manager for this run of the opera. And what you see is it's obviously Bram's response to a letter he got from this guy, David Bishop, outlining his interest to get back into the theater, get back into managing the theater, and in a nice way saying, this is the amount of money I've been paid for in the past. Essentially, it's a job interview, right? Where he's negotiating his desire to get involved and to work for what fee, but also saying, I've got some other lectures that I still have a contract to fulfill, so I could do this, but it's got to start here. And it's really nice because it's humble Bram Stoker, and you see the way he interacts with somebody in what, back in those days, everything was really quite polite, really, but doing fairly having to be a shrewd negotiator to make sure you got enough money to make it worth your while to do something.
There's a fine line there.
but yeah, exactly. But what it also did for myself and Mike Shepard, this friend of mine who lives in Cruden Bay, Scotland, and he's the driving force behind finding out all the facts of when Bram Stoker was in Cruden Bay, what books he wrote while he was there, and Dracula was one of them. But since I now have a letter with the date 1906 on it, we know, and then Bram wrote in hand when he crossed out his own letterhead and put in Kilmarnock Arms Hotel Crew, Port Errol, Scotland. So that's where he was, and that's some more proof. We like to have 2 or 3 pieces of evidence to prove where Bram was and what he was doing and what his frame of mind was at the time when he was there.
Yeah, that's just absolutely fascinating. One thing, speaking of, I guess, putting things into frame, so to speak, as well, I know, and I know we talked about this a little bit before, and I hope you don't mind me going back here again, because
Sure.
I think it is important to discuss, and I'm sure that other folks, listening in and watching in here will probably be just as shocked as I am to know that as far as bringing the annotated version to to the light of day as well, you mentioned that you had a little bit of difficulty in doing that, and I would imagine that, in a sense, because this is ultimately now public domain, because Dracula itself, of course, I think it's obviously older than 50 years. So in a lot of ways, it could be a race to see who sort of puts this sort of a version out there before. I understand that there is a version of an annotated book of Dracula that's been floating around for a little while. But I wanted to give you an opportunity as well, and to tell everybody as it's tuned in here what the difference is, and to know that it's not just a matter of, well, there's a Stoker name attached to this, so we should buy it. There's obviously a lot more significance than just your name attached to this particular book. If you wouldn't mind maybe discussing that so the folks know to get the right one or the best one that's out there.
No, I'm glad. And I wouldn't say it's the best one, because here's the way annotated books work. When you purchase an annotated, you're purchasing, or you should be purchasing, the book based somewhat on the person who has done the annotations. Do you like that person's work? Do you like that person's point of view? Do you have confidence that that person has done their research and therefore are going to give you a lot of interesting footnotes? Okay. And so David Scull and John Edgar Browning have done one recently that came out by Norton. Leslie Klinger, who's a good friend of mine, has done one a few years ago.
Okay.
Leonard Wolf did one a number of years ago. So there's been a number done, but what you've got to look at is say, just like, why would you come on Rick Hipson's show on his podcast? Well, I like the way Rick asks people questions. I like the research Rick does. I like his mannerism. So it's just like choosing a podcaster, an interviewer, a guy that has a TV show, a late night host. Do you like what he does, how he presents himself? It's similar to that. And so when you look at the book that Dacre Stoker and Robert Basang did, you're getting a mixture of incredibly detailed vampire works and references to all, I mean all of the important annotated Draculas going back 50 years. That's what Robert was all about, making sure that he cherry-picked different things that he felt were valuable contributions to the novel Dracula over the past 50 years by different reputable authors. So that's what makes it into footnotes. So they may not all be original and brand new footnotes that we look at. We read the book and say, oh, this is a wonderful passage. The way Bela Lugosi said this in the 1931 movie was this, or Gary Oldman did this. Some people do have references to movie. What Robert and I did was reference a lot of the reputable other annotated Draculas. That's important. The other thing is I am able to bring information from my family, and that is certain documents that I have got from them, certain perspectives. We've actually got interesting perspectives from Bram Stoker's great grandsons in here. Also his great granddaughter, she put something in there for us. So we went to some of my relatives, cousins, and their children, said, is there anything interesting about Dracula, cool story that you want to help us tell the public? We thought interesting, and where do you think it would work in? So those are footnotes.
Okay.
And then the other pieces was just this puzzle building that I felt was really important, and access to things like the typescript and the 1901 paperback edition that very, very hard to get your hands on. If any of your listeners don't believe me, you try to go right now and find a paperback edition based, from 1901, not just a cheap version that somebody's turned into paperback. It's the actual 1901 words that Archibald Constable put out, Bram's reduced book by 30,000 words. So I look at a lot of Facebook pages and people, different Dracula pages. Where do we get one of these paperback editions? How do we find it? Well, I said, well, darn it, I'm just going to combine this with this. And when our publisher had this brilliant idea of the grayscaling, it's like, good. Now you got a 2-for-1. Well, then you get the typescript added, and you got a 3-for-1. Now you got all the notes and references to the different chapters that are taken. Now you got a 4-for-1. And we've even referenced the abridged screen, sorry, not abridged, I'm sorry, the staged, what's still Sylvia Starshine, a good friend of Robert's, who I met when we went over to London. She actually published the staged reading of Dracula, the script for it, which lives in the British Museum. And what's interesting is Bram cut and pasted 2 first edition of Draculas onto a few hundred pages and added in his own little notes and things for the actors to say.
Wow.
Rick, there was one and one only script that was passed between the 12 different people who were reading that day. And it was just a methodical reading to satisfy the Lord Chamberlain's office, so Bram would protect the dramatic rights of Dracula. So it's not something that was meant for a production. It was just for a staged reading to satisfy the rules of the day. So Bram would protect the dramatic rights of Dracula. And thank goodness he did it, because when he died, he left his wife, these rights. She ended up working with Hamilton Dean and John Balderston, and ended up turning this into the staged version of Dracula. And then those staged rights were sold to Universal for the 1931 film. So in a way, Bram left a gold mine to his wife because of that protection. And that protection, that script, Sylvia Starshine has published. Robert and I looked at that as a version of an annotated Dracula and took bits of that and said, oh, in the stage reading, Bram said this about this particular scene, which was not always the same as the novel. Sometimes he just used different phrases, sometimes a slightly different idea, just a little bit off, to just be one of those aha moments.
Gotcha. But you have to figure that I'm sure that the notes and the writing that was in the stage play that's not necessarily in the typescript or the novel was probably notes that it sounds like he probably had around for a long time before he even set out to write the novel than the stage play, I would think.
Yeah, it's tough to say, because it's hard to say, Rick. I think when I look at it chronologically, since he cut up, I mean, literally before you and I do cut and pasting on computers, obviously that didn't exist.
Right.
You can see that he took a pair of scissors to 2 editions of Dracula. And this was the date of this staged reading was 8 days before the book was published. So his publisher must have handed him what we call galleys, right?
Yeah.
He cut them up, stuck them onto pages, and then wrote in with hand, Mina, and then a little line to what Mina's saying, Jonathan, the Count, Homewood, So he quickly puts together this script. I don't know how long before the book came out did he have these in his hands, but you can't figure too long. And then this thing was read 8 days before the book comes out on May the 26th, 1897. So did he just make up these little thoughts, in over 2 or 3 days? These extra bits? Probably, because it wasn't supposed to be a polished work. It was just to get the damn thing approved.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense, and it's just the meticulousness just blows me away. I mean, he literally cut and pasted these things together. Like that just blows me away.
What you've got to realize,
kids think they have it tough right now with the working from a computer.
Yeah, exactly. And what people have to realize is the nature of Bram Stoker himself. He was a meticulous person. He, did study at Trinity College. He got a master's in mathematics. He was also a head of the Philosophical Society, head of the Historical Society. And then he went to work as a clerk in the Petty Sessions Legal Department and did such a good job, he got promoted to be the inspector of clerks all over Ireland. And because of that, he noticed that the work that all the clerks were doing in Petty Sessions Legal Department all over Ireland was in such disarray. He came back and told his boss, and his boss said, well, fix it. And so Bram Stoker wrote a manual that was in use up until 1960s about the duties of the clerks of Petty Sessions throughout Ireland. So that was like a total manual, exactly how to do your job. So this was Mr. Meticulous. And then, of course, he goes on to manage a theater for 27 years. And he's got all the numbers, the accounting, all in the right columns. You can see by the book that he created for his ledger. So when he writes Dracula, not only does he get into this sort of incredible creative mind, but he's got all the meticulous bits and pieces of all the legal references, how all the crates of dirt have to be shipped from one place to another, all the legalities involved in bringing things from one country and shipping them to the other. Yeah. He's got all kinds of things that are very detail oriented that are mixed in amongst this very kind of creative, horrifying story. And Rick, one reason why I think it resonates so well is that all those little details that Bram puts in makes the story feel real. Absolutely. References to people, places, things. It's a very realistic feeling book. And that's what scared people so much.
Right. Yeah. I imagine there's a lot of people that read that certainly paid a lot more attention to bats or, what might be outside their windows and things of that nature, because like you said, I mean, it was all done so realistically. It may as well have been, a walking tour guide into hunting down Dracula and all the things you were likely to find along the way. I found absolutely just incredible. And I saw that you shared it on your Facebook page too, so which I thought was super cool. Because I wanted to talk to you about that and have it fresh, but that's cool that you've already read it. But it was in regards to some recent research that was done regarding very, very old letters where, but rather than DNA, which can only take you back so far, where they can actually look into the molecular structure of a piece of paper and being able to pick up anything that's on there, any bit of saliva, any bit of dust that might have been in the area at the time, to really drive down, maybe what happened, what the environment was like at that particular time that letter was read. If a bit of sweat or saliva was on there, they can break down the molecular structure to the point where they can tell, oh, that person had this ailment or that ailment. And I think you mentioned, or you mentioned, or you shared that rather in your Facebook. Do you think that there's ever a possibility that this might be something you would look into as an option for some of the letters that you have? Because I know one of the big mysteries of Bram Stoker, the man, was specifically what type of an ailment he maybe had it as a child, where it was likely that he experienced a lot of bloodletting, and that might have alluded to some of the references, or at least the ideas regarding Dracula, for obviously the bloodletting that takes place. Do you see that as a perhaps a possibility of something that would be worth looking into for you, to see if we can get even further along the lines of what might have happened with Bram Stoker as a youngster?
I'm really glad you brought this one up because again, I didn't find it. Somebody brought it to my attention. They sent it to me, said, "Hey,
Okay.
have you seen this one?" And then immediately I read it, I digested it, I thought about it. I go, "This is cool. This needs sharing," and so I shared it because it's to me, it's very new, cutting edge science. Which we all know the novel Dracula was cutting edge science at the time with all the medical advances that were used at the time, courtesy of Bram's eldest brother. But more to your point, and I can't remember, Rick, if the term had to do with microproteins or something, but carbon dating is one thing people have done to look at the age of fossils and stuff. But this one was done by two people, and they started off looking into Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, Vlad the Third, about what was he like, what was going on with him when he wrote this particular document that was creating Bucharest as a city at the time. So obviously you look at when somebody's resting their hand on the paper, or any saliva or anything that could have dropped on the paper at the time, and the air quality, all those kind of things. I guess some of these things last, and now we've got the science to figure out what was going on. So I was thinking exactly the same thing, Rick, with all the pieces of paper that exist at the Rosenbach, the original pieces of paper of Bram's notes, the letters that I have and been able to purchase by auction, and others. Wouldn't that be cool to find the ability to do some sort of a DNA analysis, or an analysis of the paper, the ink, to kind of get a read on Bram Stoker, what was going on in its body? As you said, it's probably one of the biggest mysteries to me, is what actually caused that mysterious 7-year illness of young Bram. For those that don't know, he wasn't expected to live. He struggled for 7 years. I've got reason to believe that he was bloodlet, and that most likely led to his very dark sense of imagination. That bloodletting probably involved leeching. And there's actually a line in Dracula where Jonathan Harker describes Count Dracula looking like he was, full with a leech full with his repletion of blood after Dracula had just obviously had a meal of blood. So that probably happened to Bram. But boy, if I had any scientific evidence, or if they say, if you got to bring back somebody in history and could ask them one question, what would it be? That would be it. What was it that caused your life to be like this? And my goodness, if we have the opportunity scientifically to analyze some of these papers, could we find something out about him? Boy, I'd jump at that opportunity. But I thought that was really, really cool that these two people are starting to do this. And I guess, it's probably pretty expensive. So they're getting funding from, university or something to continue this. And I bet you, Rick, in the next few years, we'll see some interesting results from different analysis that these two people get to do.
I think so.
What was a guy on drugs when he wrote this? Was a guy, what diseases did he have? Did this cause these weird things to happen? Who knows?
What really killed the dinosaurs?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, it absolutely fascinates me. And to bridge off of that as well, Dacre, and I know this is something that you're very passionate about before, and I'm so glad that I've got this opportunity to ask you and to get a very accurate response as far as the correlation, or I shouldn't say the correlation, but the alleged correlation between, of course, our favorite undead mythical creature, Dracula, and Vlad the Impaler, where, again, you read all kinds of scholarly papers on folks that are claimed to be experts on vampires and Dracula, and there's always that tie-in about how how much Bram Stoker must have borrowed from Vlad the Impaler. And, this is where you got all these, this is where maybe we have the whole wooden stake thing. It's because Vlad used to love to put his victims on a stake and all this kind of stuff. But what do you say to people like that? Because I know we talked a bit about that offline, but I wanted to give an opportunity to kind of clear the air for everybody out there. So there's at least one source material that folks can go to get to the truth behind what Vlad means to or doesn't mean to Dracula.
That's probably the second most popular question that I get. Where's your proof?
Sure.
What do you know about Bram Stoker and his knowledge of Vlad Dracula and Vlad the Impaler? Because obviously, at a certain point in film history, the connection was made much closer than what Bram has actually used in his novel. I think the Dracula Untold with Luke Evans actually is the movie surrounded all about how Vlad the Impaler chose to become a vampire to defend his people from the Turks. The 1992 Coppola movie, the first 4 to 5 minutes, it's all about excuse me, all
Sure.
about Vlad the Impaler, who was rebelling against the church because his wife committed suicide and couldn't be buried in a consecrated graveyard. Bram Stoker's his novel is much more elusive. There is not a lot of information about where Count Dracula in Bram's novel becomes a vampire. And a lot, the stuff that we do know that he referenced was a place called the Sholamonts, which is a sort of mythical school of the dark arts in Transylvania that Bram picked up from this 2-volume books from Emily Gerard, a Scottish lady who wrote and was living in Transylvania when she wrote all about Transylvanian superstitions, all about vampires, all the superstitions surrounding them, the snaking of the heart, the garlic, all that kind of stuff. That's Emily Gerard, and we can see that. He's mentioned it in his notes, and we now know those 2 books are in the London Library. I've purchased the same editions, and you read it all there. But Emily Gerard does not talk about Vlad the Impaler. This is all the superstitions that Bram attaches to this real count that he read about in 2 books. And he just happened to go to Whitby in the beginning, near the very beginning of the summer of 1890, when he was writing the novel Dracula. We know from his notes that he started just a month or 2 before that, and he was beginning to set the story in Austria. He was going to have the Count arrive into Dover, but when he went to Whitby on a holiday with his wife and son, he wandered into the Whitby subscription library and checked out a book called The Principles of Wallachia, Moldavia by William Wilkinson, and it had a specific entry in it that he copied into his notes. So, if he copied something into his notes, we know it caught his eye. It mentioned that the Wallachians were at this time, as they are at present, used to using the name Dracula for somebody associated, being showing cruel actions or cunning, and it means the devil. We also know it means dragon later on, but Wilkinson didn't mention that. So he's connected in this book to a devil. So at that time, I believe it caught Bram's eye because he had been watching Henry Irving playing the role of Mephistopheles, this devil creature, in the play Faust, and everything about Dracula was the occult, and this was going on in Victorian society. He's interested in the occult and all these sort of occult practices. So Bram was latching onto a devil, and he saw this in his book by Wilkinson. Then he gets back to London and goes to the London Library, and sure enough, there's another book in there by a guy called James Samuelson, who goes into more detail. And this is a game changer, Rick, because my friends who are the scholars, Miller and Basang, who wrote the notes, there was only one little mention of Samuelson's book in the Dracula notes, but it was enough to point out that Bram was reading this book and that he was interested in this writer who was also a lawyer, but he was a traveler, and he traveled around and wrote these very factual books. And he mentioned about Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, being known as the devil, and he mentioned a lot of wars and battles that he fought. So this book by Samuelson is a bit of a game changer because it does help us with the argument that Bram Stoker knew more than was just previously known in the Wilkinson book that Dracula means devil, that we now know the backstories. So it makes sense when you read the novel Dracula and you can see all the references that Bram has made to the backstory that Dracula boasts to Jonathan Harker about, back in the old days, I did this,
Right.
and the blood of Attila goes through my veins. And so we now know he gets that from not only the Samuelson book, but the Major Johnson book and the Charles Bonner book, that other things in the London Library were steeped in this history of the battles between the Austrian-Hungarians and the Ottomans and the Wallachians and the Transylvanians, all this sort of mixture of battles and superstitions all mixed into one. Bram just took all this stuff and made what I call his Dracula soup, this mixture of stuff that creates a mythical creature, but with a lot of factual background. And that's the key, is so that people would realize, oh yeah, I've heard of that guy, but I didn't realize he was a vampire, or I didn't realize he was a real guy, or he was from here.
Yeah.
There's enough reality to create what they call the willful suspension of disbelief. And that was enough for Bram to, again, just like I said earlier, to make the story seem real and realistic enough to get people's attention.
Gotcha. That's incredible. There's so much history, of course, with Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler, and all this, and obviously Bram really studied that as meticulously as he's studied anything, to the point where you would think he'd been to Transylvania and all he did was study the heck out of it and immerse himself in that research, that he would have very thoroughly researched everything there was to research regarding Vlad, but yet he only took just a small smidgen of that research to, I guess, influence the name Dracula, as well as the hint of Dracula's background, without actually going too much into detail. But that made such a huge difference, in the book, where you can picture Dracula as previously being this, great almighty warlord and ruler of all these lands, and an incredible warrior, with, again, just a little smidgen of the history that he took from all of his research. I think is just incredible the way that Bram applied that.
He also applied the name out of this Wilkinson and Samuelson book, Dracula, up until this point. We've seen in his notes, and we reference this in our annotated Dracula.
Yeah.
He was going to call his count Wampyr, or Vampyr, Wampyr, which is Austrian for a vampire. This is where he was originally going to set the story. And I say this and I kind of have to roll my eyes, and I'm sure you'll do the same. Imagine the name Vampyr instead of Dracula. It just doesn't have that, iconic bite to it. Dracula. If it wasn't, who knows if you would have had the success or the longevity with sort of a wimpy name like Wampyr.
Yeah, so, womp.
And we don't, so we're okay. We don't have to worry about it. But as it stands, there's, again, lots of cool little bits and pieces. Rick, let's talk about. I'm not sure how much time you have left with me, but let's talk about the ending, because it's another great example of Bram's meticulous nature of writing. Again, I mentioned all the details that he got from Emily Gerard from Land Beyond the Forest, but Bram had a couple of maps. One was in Land Beyond the Forest, one by Charles Bonner book, and I bought copies of the exact same books and the same maps, and we've seen the layout of Transylvania, and Bram uses all the same towns, that were at that time, so very authentic. But he also left in his notes map coordinates. And a friend of mine, Hans de Roos, and he bounced all this off myself and Robert, discovered these map coordinates sitting in plain sight, in pencil, fairly faint, that pointed to a specific place in Transylvania. And it's up in the northeast corner of Transylvania in a volcanic region of the mountain. And I've been there, as has Hans de Roos, to verify that Bram Stoker had a plan to set his fictional castle Dracula on a volcano. So everything you've heard about Bran Castle in Transylvania is about 400 miles to the south of this location where he set his story, right at the bottom of the Borgo Pass between the mountain ranges in the Carpathians. So he used the real name, the Borgo Pass, in the novel, and Klausenberg and Bistrita and the carriage paths and the train routes, all the same, exist to this day. But what was important to Bram was this extinct volcano. And why is that important? Because at the time of his writing of this, there was this great lack of knowledge of geology and understanding of, seismology and so on. But Bram references that in the novel. Again, some of those things crossed out because he edited out of the end of the story right after the Count is stabbed with Morris's Bowie knife, a volcanic eruption. So at the highlight of all the action of the story, the Count's throat is slit, the knife goes into his chest, he crumbles into dust. Does he make an escape? Is he actually dead? But right after that moment, the volcano erupts and everybody has to run for cover. Now, if that volcano really did erupt, there's a good chance that many people would be killed, because you can't be standing on the side of a volcano and run for cover easily. It's difficult. So Bram Stoker, being as meticulous as he was, if he's planning to have the volcanic eruption at the end of the story, and for whatever reason, his editor or he decides to cut it out, and you can see that last page is just cut out, and we leave it in there so everybody can read it. You just see where the lines are to take it out. He's going to have a volcanic eruption, certainly on a mountain that's really a volcano. And when you backtrack through the last chapters before that, you can see lots of vague references to sulfurous gases, earth tremors, seismology. Ooh, I wish Palmieri was here to tell me. This is the Italian geophysicist that's explaining about seismology. I wish we knew what was going on. Essentially, Rick, they're getting close to hell. This is the home of the devil. Hell,
right.
Volcanoes. So this is what people in the Victorian era were believing was, the portal to hell. And of course, Bram ties it all together at the end. Dracula is his devil, as the name depicts. And we've got a volcanic eruption, even though it's deleted out. And the coordinates of this exact place are sitting here, in his notes. So it all kind of comes together as the final piece of the puzzle to let us know what Bram was thinking. And again, it's all laid out in our annotated Dracula, and I love to present it to the world this way, so they get the full picture of what Bram was thinking.
100%. Yeah, it's like he closed the door to hell, but then you wonder what's going to happen if it ever opens up again.
Well, that's the sequel, isn't it?
100%. And it's cool too, because I know you have a picture on your Facebook as well of you at that specific location where Castle Dracula is, pointing it at this beautiful scenic area, and clearly it wasn't always that serenic, because now that they cleared away Castle Dracula, it's a little bit nicer and alluring for people, which I thought that maybe should be people's first warning. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. It's not always what it seems, but there is a plaque up there now on Mount Israel.
Oh, no kidding.
In the Kalamani National Park. I actually financed it and brought it over 2 years after we discovered it, and it's now up there showing that this is a location of Bram Stoker's fictional castle in both English and Romanian. and I buried amongst a pile of rocks, a little rock cairn. I buried, my son and I did, a small thermos with notes inside in different languages saying, you have found the location of Bram Stoker's fictional castle. Would you please email me if you find this, just to let me know you've made it. And to date, nobody has sent me that yet. Maybe I should have left it at a more prominent place, but I do know that people are actually now going on tours there, sort of post-pandemic, and certainly, sadly, the Ukrainian war going on, which is borders onto Romania. I'll be going back there and taking tours up there starting in June, because we feel that the refugees coming into Romania has kind of slowed down a little bit. They got a good handle on it, and it's really quite safe. But yeah, it's cool to be part of this literary trail, to let people come and see. Certainly go visit Bran Castle 400 miles to the south, because we do know in those two books that I mentioned, one by Bonner, one by Elizabeth Mattuccelli. Bram looked at that castle and sketched in his mind, looked at these sketches, wrote a description of the Castle Dracula, based on these two sketches. He just moved it 400 miles to the north to place it on this volcano. And incidentally, Cruden Bay, Scotland, that I talked about at the top of the show, is another castle that Bram used for the internal layout of Castle Dracula. He took that and merged it to Bran Castle and stuck it on Mount Israel. So Bram was a big merger. He merged many things together to suit his needs. And this Dracula's Castle is a merger of Slane's Castle and Bran Castle.
There you go. Maybe he had a little bit of Frankenstein influence in him as far as that goes, stitching all the pieces together.
Yeah, and a volcano at the end, who knows?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. And I guess speaking of that as well, with the tours, I know you're on a bit of a hiatus, which is probably really nice, because I swear every time I go on your socials, you're somewhere else in the middle of the world, or touring through the States and that. Now, are you going to be commencing that going into next year as well? And I guess a most important question from my bias chair over here in Canada is: do you have any plans to come through and make Canada part of your stops?
Well, at the moment, I start in February again, and I've got a California tour. I've gotten quite popular up there, and I haven't been there much, so people want to hear the stories. And then I'm back to England for an event in March. But in May, because May 26th is the anniversary, the 126th anniversary of Dracula, I'll be back in leading a tour. We've got some people signed up to come with us. We go to York, go to Whitby, we go to Edinburgh, Scotland, and we go to Cruden Bay. And we sort of, read Dracula along the way, and I share the notes and all that kind of good stuff. So if people want to jump on that, you can go to experience/Transylvania.com is the company I work with, and they actually have on their website all the description of these tours. We'll be going to Transylvania in June to go to places associated with both Vlad Dracula as well as Bram's fictional Count Dracula. And our plans are to go to this location again. If the weather's nice, we'll head up there. As far as Canada goes, it's my native country. I would love to go back to Montreal or Toronto and give lectures. Basically, Rick, it comes to this: if any of you listeners want to organize and hosting me at a location, which involves covering expenses, mind you, I love to come and give my talk, because I do this audiovisual presentation of Bram's life and his research and his writing. It's about 90 minutes, and usually it goes over quite well. I love to talk about the subject and let people know a little bit more about who Bram is and what went into his life and his writing of the novel. So I'd love to share it, but I can't just do it for free everywhere, because the expenses do run up a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, you don't have the ability of turning yourself into a bat and just kind of flying wherever your heart takes you.
I know. It would be
or
great.
Do you?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because of course we know that it's the original Bram Stoker's Dracula. The vampire is not so adverse to the daylight, so it's you
That's
can
right.
go anywhere, anytime.
Yeah, exactly. That got changed with the Nosferatu, that he gets burned in the daytime. But he just doesn't have as much power. He might have to fly in an airplane during the daytime.
Yeah, and I was surprised too. Speaking of that Nosferatu, it's going to be getting another. I've been hearing some talks about. I don't know if they're in post production, but that they're
I've heard that.
going ahead to make that. And of course, I had to think back to way back in the day when the original what was it? Can't think of the original production company that ultimately went out of business because of that.
Piranha Films. Yeah,
that's it. Yeah, that's I guess Bram's late wife. Florence, that she went to bat for and said, you can't just steal my husband's work and make it your own kind of thing. So
yeah, we understand that. I wrote an article about that with my son's help. It came into Scream magazine in May of this past year, and did a lot of research on Florence's battle. But the bottom line is, because Bram protected the dramatic rights to the story, and it was discovered that Prana Films, and they openly admitted this was freely adapted from Bram Stoker's Dracula. They funnily enough, they didn't try to hide it. I don't know if they thought they could just get away with it, but bottom line, it was what I believe with my research, the first copyright infringement from book to movie, and the German courts and the Incorporated Society of Authors helped Florence Stoker fund a 2.5-year battle to address the situation, and the courts ruled in favor of Mrs. Stoker and the Incorporated Society of Authors against Prana Films. But when Prana Films were given the verdict, they couldn't pay any restitutions. They claimed they were bankrupt. So the German court said, then you must destroy all copies of the film. Well, the film had already moved around the world for previews, so they couldn't destroy all the film, which in a way, Rick, is not a bad thing, because it's a pretty cool movie, and it's celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. And as you said, it's going through a couple of reboots since then. And Florence Stoker did okay, obviously, with the sale of the dramatic rights on stage and on film later on. She did well, but she also, I think, did the right thing and set precedent for book to film copyright infringements, which many authors around the world should be thankful for, even though some people say, oh, gee, she tried to ruin a film. In fact, she was standing up for the right thing, which is Bram would have been very proud of, with the legal type of mind that he was, and she was pretty legal minded as well.
Absolutely, because I've discussed it with, I know a lot of authors, that unfortunately didn't do that, put that caveat in place, or that safeguard in place, and then movies went on to turn their books into these incredible blockbuster films, and that author got absolutely not even so much as a credit out of it. So it's great that Florence stood up, and that was the absolute, like you said, it's 100% the right thing to do. Not just the legal thing to do, but it's the right thing to do.
And stick with it for 2.5 years. It was not easy, especially being a female back in those days, to stick it to them.
100%. Yeah, that was a big win on a lot of levels.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I guess if you don't mind, Dacre, then to wrap things up, I suppose, really, really enjoyed your time for this today. I swear I could sit here for all day long and just soak it all up. I guess, again, to me, this is just absolutely fascinating to me. I've, not just from a historical standpoint, because as I get older, history becomes more important to me as I've got more history myself, but also, as I mentioned ad nauseum to you before, that, the vampires and specifically Dracula has always been my first true love as far as the dark culture kind of stuff goes. Where do we go from here as far as Dracula and upholding the history of that, and any kind of additional works that you have planned out that we can look forward to enjoying more of Dracula? Because, we all know Dracula must go on.
Absolutely. Well, there's a couple of projects that I can speak about. Some I've signed NDAs for that I can't, but I will tell you this, that I'm working right now with a fellow that I've written a couple of short stories with, Dr. Leverett Butts, who's a professor in University of North Georgia. And he's a great storyteller, and he can really help me tell this story. And it's Bram Stoker's the summer in Cruden Bay that he wrote Dracula, and it is much like the other two books that I co-authored with J.D. Barker and Ian Holt, which are fictional stories but based heavily on facts. And it's the sort of the really strange things that go on in Bram Stoker's life while he's trying to write this book. The research has been done at this point, and so that's probably about a year away from coming out, but we're making good progress on it. The other one is it's a type of electronic book that is kind of interesting. That's going to involve some sort of annotations, but videos. So you would be like an ebook that you would buy, and I would be talking much like I am here, giving highlights of different things that Bram put into the book, showing maps and visual aids.
Oh, that's really cool.
That come into it. So there's sort of a visual component. I've got a buddy who's really good with editing, and we're going to have one of these maps have the sort of line that goes along that shows where Harker is when this is happening, and imagery
Oh,
along
that's
the way.
cool.
So that's in the works. And then the other thing is, there's also a move, and again, I can't give too much because I don't know too much. I'm just not allowed to. But there's some traction, let's just say, with Dracula in getting more attention in Hollywood than it has in the past. So we're just crossing our fingers that in the new year we'll have some more news that we can share. But just things are moving ahead in a way that I'm pretty excited about as well for that.
That's
so
awesome. That's a huge tease, but I asked for it, so
yeah, you did, and I can only give you so much at the moment, though. So
yeah, nope, totally get that. I definitely don't want anything being pulled back on that particular endeavor. So no, that's very exciting.
Yeah. So he's not going anywhere. I think as I joke with people at the 125th. Here's to another 125 years of sleepless nights, Rick. I think we're all ready
Absolutely.
for just a little bit more.